Yes, thanks very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. It's a bit difficult to follow an ex-Director General of the BBC, but I'll do my best. As Jeanette says, a lot of the themes that Greg raised were actually associated with what's happening in the digital world. And therefore, much of what I say is I think, closely linked to what he was saying. What I'll be talking about is mainly the UK, but I will attempt to now and again sort of look a bit more broadly and think what this means for public service broadcasting elsewhere in the world. I think it's possible, and you'll see what I mean in a second, it's possible to overestimate the impact of change, but it's also possible to underestimate it. And can I just start with a couple of quotes which really are about continuity. So this is from Barb. Barb is an audience research company in the UK. Full year viewing figures for 2012 from Barb reveal that viewers in the UK watch an average of 4 hours, 1 minute a day of linear TV on a TV set, a minute below the record level set in 2011. This is the third consecutive year that linear TV viewing on a TV set has remained above an average of 4 hours a day. So traditional linear viewing, still very much a feature of the UK marketplace. And then another quote with some other statistics, again from Barb. 90% effectively of linear TV in 2012 was watched live as it was broadcast, compared to 90.3% in 2011. Again, so not only is television watched linear, most people are watching it live. So all the notion of time-shifted viewing or streaming, those things are obviously relevant, but they're not quite as prominent as one might have thought. However, there have been already some very, very fundamental changes in the UK marketplace, and those affect public service broadcasting, and I think there are many more to come. So what am I going to be talking about in that context? Well, first of all, share changes. So I'm just going to look at viewing share changes and what those mean. Think about its impact on the positioning of the BBC, and as you'll see, I think the BBC is more or less coincident with public service broadcasting in the UK. Those of you not familiar with the UK, in the past, we've had a number of public service broadcasters, and there's a big question now as to whether that is still the case or not. My view is probably not. And then, as Jeanette says, we've got to think about the money. I will pick up on radio a little bit towards the end of this as well. So you don't have to look at this in any detail. I'll just tell you what it means. This is the viewing share of a lot of different channels, and I think BBC One is this one here. You can see it's diminished over a 10 or 12 or whatever it is year period. And this is others. This is other channels. So they've grown. And so, quite a radical shift in a sort of 15, I think it's a sort of 15-year period. But in a sense, the sort of just that change that as represented there doesn't really fully reflect what's been going on, because in that period, some of the channels that were considered public service broadcasting, in addition to the BBC, have arguably changed their status. So ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5, which are many of the other lines on, three of the other lines on this chart, have become perhaps less public service in nature. So what that means is there has been a very, very radical shift in the share that public service broadcasting has taken of viewing in the UK. So, are ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5 public service broadcasters or not? They are still formally public service broadcasters. But let's try and think about it in output terms. Is there anything about that output that is particularly public service? They do still put a lot of effort into original production. They have obligations on them which are not trivial either in terms of news and things of that nature. So in output terms, there are some components of it, of what they do that are public service. In terms of input, in terms of intervention, what are the things that make them public service? I think that's becoming less and less important. I would say that if their public service status was suddenly removed from them, I'm not sure that there would be a big shift in what they actually do. So as I said, I put a question mark whether or not they're really PSB, but I think in my heart of hearts, I'm skeptical that they are genuine public service players in the way that Channel 4 and ITV definitely were, let's say in 1990. So the BBC is left there as the only player in the public service space, if you believe that view. And then that raises a very, very big issue for public service broadcasting, which is what I call there the public service ghetto becomes more likely. And going back to what Greg was talking about before coffee, he quoted Hugh Weldon when he said that one of the purposes of public service broadcasting, or the BBC, is to make the good popular and the popular good. Now, it's much more difficult to do that if your share of viewing is very low. So the old idea was there was this notion of the hammock that the BBC would schedule popular programming at a particular time and then lead people through into less popular programming. Now, and that works if you're running BBC One and BBC One has a 40% share of viewing for let's say EastEnders, and then can pull people through to the next part of the schedule. But it's more difficult if you're not talking about a 40% share, but speaking figuratively and looking to the future, a 4% share. It's much more difficult to sustain that type of strategy, and and sustaining that type of strategy is arguably very important for sustaining the whole issue of public support for public service broadcasting. So, as everybody has recognised, the BBC as a public service broadcaster faces a challenge if the continuation of its erosion, if there's a continuing erosion of its viewing share. And that brings me on to the licence fee. Now, Stephen Barnett, if he was here, I think would say, the licence fee has huge support, and that is absolutely a fact. And the demise of the licence fee has been predicted throughout my professional lifetime. So one doesn't want to assume that it's as vulnerable as some people suggest, but equally it would be, I think, unwise to think of it as something that is necessarily a permanent feature. And obviously, Greg mentioned the issue of, wouldn't it be absurd to consider imposing a tax on PCs? But equally, it will become absurd to consider persisting with a tax on TVs, because even though people are watching televisions in a traditional way, that will not remain the case forever. And so even though I think there will be continuing sort of wide-scale popular support for the licence fee, it may need to change. Right, now I just want to talk about the BBC and how it's reacted so far and how I think it needs to react. So far, and Greg mentioned both of these, what the BBC has done is it has proliferated channels. It said, we're going into a multi-channel environment. We need to respond to that. And so it has added one channel after another to the point where there are a lot of BBC channels now available. And it has also pioneered technology. Now, I'm not sure that either of those really work long term. You can't go on proliferating channels at the speed at which the market will proliferate channels. And so I'm not sure that is something that the BBC should continue with. And on the technology side, I've certainly questioned whether the BBC can really do what the market can do and keep up with technology. It's done brilliantly with iPlayer, but I'm not sure that it's, if it defines its role as to pioneer technology, I don't know whether it will succeed. What I think it does need to do is it needs to rethink its core role. I think it has always, or for the past generation, has considered itself as an integrated producer-distributor of TV. Come on to radio in a second. And I just wonder again whether that's right. In a situation where the distribution is becoming complex, various, and not controllable in the way that the BBC has been able to control distribution in the past, I wonder whether it shouldn't become, as this slide suggests, focus much more on content creation and become much more distribution neutral. Move away from BBC One or BBC Two being, as it were, the defining way of getting its message across. And I think if the BBC does think along those lines, that is a radical change. It isn't attempting to control the whole value chain as it has done in the past. And the other thing it says there is regulated, and I think regulated I believe, will become a very big issue for the BBC, because I think the BBC at the moment is, I don't mean, it's obviously regulated in content terms, but I think it will become regulated in terms of its impact on the marketplace. That already is true today, but I think it will become quite a big issue, particularly if it doesn't pay attention to limiting its role in pioneering technology. Let me just talk a little bit about radio. Radio, the BBC, for those of you not familiar with the UK, the BBC is completely dominant in radio. It's got more than 50% listening share, which is much more than it's got in TV. It produces an incredible range of radio. So speech radio in the UK is fantastically successful in a way that it is very unusual internationally. And so the position of radio is both sort of particularly good, because I think most people would say UK radio is fantastic and the BBC is of pivotal importance in that, but also its dominance is an issue. And again, it comes back to the issue of regulation, which I think will become more important for the BBC in future. One of the things that I just want to sort of dwell on for a second is the situation in public service radio is therefore very different from public service television here in the UK. And I think there is a general message there about public service. We assume we're here today to talk about the challenges that public service face worldwide. And I suspect, just as there are big differences between radio and television, there are also will be big differences between public service television in the UK versus public service television anywhere else in the world. Right, I've got one last slide, which is my conclusion. The BBC is absolutely one of the very few world-class media entities in the UK and Europe, but as Greg was saying, it will need to think radically if it is to survive and flourish as it has done for the last nearly 100 years. I believe the future of PSB is about content, not about distribution, and the BBC needs therefore to think about content much more than distribution, which I think, as I said, means it's not about BBC One, it's not about BBC Two, it's about its archive, it's about how that archive can be exploited, and it's about being distribution neutral, so not that means opening up commercial relationships, perhaps, with a much wider set of distribution entities than it has traditionally relied on. And in the context of both those points, don't be fooled by the current apparent institutional continuity. Although I suggested early on in this talk that viewing habits remain remarkably consistent in terms of the role of linear TV, don't think for a second that that means that the BBC doesn't need to change. I think the BBC will need to change absolutely fundamentally. And if it doesn't, it will decline in the way that I think many people in the room, and me included, would be very worried about. That's me done. Thank you.